We would like to welcome you out to our public hearing today in Eagle Mountain. We're grateful that you've braved the weather to join us. And we have with us online Commissioner Durham, and we're grateful to have her joining us. Unfortunately, we won't have Commissioner Thorne, is my understanding. Want to start by giving kind of an overview of the redistricting process that we're going through, and tell you a little bit about the commission. The commission was created as a result of the 2018 referendum Proposition 4. And it was further refined through a legislative compromise with Senate Bill 200 in 2020. As a result of the proposition and the further refinements, we have a 7-member commission. 3 of the members of our commission were appointed by the Republican leadership in the state legislature. 3 were appointed by the Democratic leadership in the legislature. Of those 3 that were appointed by the Republicans and the Democrats, one of those is an independent member of the commission, so has no party affiliation. Then the other 2 appointees are able to have a party affiliation. And then the chair was appointed by the commission. And so let me introduce, you may be able to read the names, but it may be a bit small from the back. But we have, again, Commissioner Durham is online with us. She was appointed by the Democrats. We have Commissioner Hale, also appointed by the Democrat. We have Commissioner Baker, who's an independent, appointed by the Republicans. I'm Rex Facer, I'm the chair. I was appointed by Governor Cox. We have Commissioner Hilliard and Commissioner Bishop, who are both appointed by the Republicans. Not with us today is Commissioner Thorne, who is an independent, who is appointed by the Democrats. The commission was established with our initial appointments in February, and we spent our first several months getting organized and getting up to speed on redistricting issues. Then in August, we received data from the Census Bureau. Normally that data would have come in about April, and we would have been able to start our mapping shortly after that. But because of the delays in the census due to the pandemic, among other reasons, the data was delayed and we weren't able to start mapping until late August. And so we've been spending time since then at mapping. And in doing the mapping, we've divided up into 3 mapping teams. Each one of those teams has either 2 people or 3 members. Each team is comprised of somebody that was appointed either by a Republican or a Democrat. And so, for example, the team that has Commissioner Bishop also has Commissioner Durham, who is appointed by the Democrats, as well as Commissioner Baker, who's an independent on that mapping team. Commissioner, all of a sudden, Hilliard. I've only been seeing you daily for months now. Commissioner Hilliard and Commissioner Thorne are a mapping team, and then Commissioner Hale and I are also a mapping team. So each one of these mapping teams has been meeting since late August to devise a set of maps that we're now starting to bring them together as a commission to try and figure out which one of those we want to advance. But each one of the maps that we have drawn is available on our website. Our staff will show you that a little bit later on in the meeting. But what we think is one of the innovative things that we've done is each of our mapping sessions where we have teams drawing maps is being broadcast on YouTube while we're doing that mapping. So if any of you want to go back and see how is it that they possibly arrived at some crazy map that we have, you can go back and watch the dialogue that's going on between the mapping folks. And what I want to do now is share with you the criteria that we've been using as we've been making our mapping decision. The first criteria, and in many ways the preeminent criteria, is that of equal population. The courts have required that each district has as equal a population as practicable, which means is as achievable as possible. Now, for our congressional districts, that means our population target is 817,904 people. We can have small deviations, but we can't have really large deviations to try and keep to that equal population as possible. Now, in our target deviations, we are using the target numbers that were established by the Legislative Redistricting Committee. And so we will eventually be submitting our maps to the legislature for the legislature to consider. The legislature will be making the ultimate decision on what maps will be adopted. But we hope that the process that we're going through and the maps that we will end up submitting will foster a productive dialogue among the legislature, and ultimately we hope that they'll be adopted. The state Senate has a target of about 112,814. The House seats have a target population of 43,622. And I will note, for those of you that grabbed a piece of paper that shows the population of Eagle Mountain, according to the census, that you're one off of being an ideal House district population size. Lastly, the state school board has a target population of 218,108. Now, for the target populations, the deviations for the state Senate, state House, and state school board is a little wider than the target deviation for the congressional maps. And that gives us a little more leeway to try and do things like keep cities and counties as whole as possible. But we have other criteria as well. So one of the criteria we have is contiguity. So we have to have areas being, they have to be touching each other. So we can't, for example, decide that we're going to have a state Senate district, and let's assume for a moment that the good folks here in Eagle Mountain don't like the folks in Saratoga Springs, and so they say, no, we want to be with Lehigh and not Saratoga Springs. We can't skip over Saratoga Springs to get to Lehigh. And so it has to be contiguous. And so a Senate district in that case would have to likely include Saratoga Springs and Eagle Mountain and some additional population to get to the 112,814 number. We also are trying to have our districts be as compact as possible. Now, that is reasonably feasible along the Wasatch Front, where we have population in relatively compact areas. That is less easy to do in the more rural parts of the state, where our population is widely dispersed. That said, we still want, even in those areas that are rural populations, we still want to try and keep those districts reasonably compact, to not have them unnecessarily large. And I'm sure that'll come up in some of our discussions later today. One of the other criteria that we're looking at that is interesting is communities of interest. Now, communities of interest are groups of people that essentially are able to self-identify. It may be a neighborhood, it could be an economic community, it could be a cultural community that people share the same identity. And trying to get that data, there's not a readily available data source that we can easily turn to and go, that will give us all of the communities of interest that exist. And so what we've been doing is we've been asking members of the public, and we've gone out to community events across the state to ask people to identify their communities of interest. And so we've gotten over 1,000 submissions of communities of interest. And what we've been doing is we've been analyzing those and essentially stacking them on top of each other so we can see the underlying patterns. And we've divided the communities of interest data that we've gotten into about 9 categories, ranging from, as we said, neighborhoods and economic interest to religious and cultural communities that people identify. The challenge is that if we don't have enough input from people, we won't know where their communities are. Now, there are some places, like we were in Provo last night, where the city has established kind of formal neighborhoods that really have become quite cohesive. And so there are times where we have that kind of information relatively available, where we can use that. But other times, in other places, we don't necessarily know if there's, if we're going to have to split a place like Eagle Mountain, for example, where would it make sense to split it? Now, ideally, because one of our other criteria is trying to keep cities and counties whole, we would prefer not to split, but if we have to split it, splitting it in a way that makes sense and preserves communities is better than splitting those communities up. We've also been asked to pay attention to natural, geographic, and man-made features. So if we can, to use something like I-15 as a natural border, or something like Utah Lake as a natural border. We've tried to pay attention to that in our map drawing. One of the other criteria that we have been given is the cores of prior districts. And so one of the things that we are analyzing is on the maps that we draw, how much do they match previous districts that existed? Now, there are challenges to that criteria, part of which is the rapid growth that we've seen in places like Eagle Mountain. Not just Eagle Mountain, but other parts of northeastern or northwestern Utah County as well. But as those areas have grown rapidly and more rapidly than other parts of the state, that will cause the patterns of representation to have to shift somewhat. And so that will mean that we can't use the same exact district that existed for Eagle Mountain previously, that it's going to have to change to some extent to match the population growth that we have. But we are looking at that to try and pay attention to that, because we understand that there is some value in the notion of continuity of representation, that if you know who your representative is, you should have the ability to vote them in or to keep them or to vote them out. And that's part of what that criteria is getting at. The last two criteria that we have are a boundary agreement. And so where we can, we want to have boundaries between districts be the same. Now, again, that's a little difficult because we have 29 Senate seats, 75 House seats, 15 state school districts, 4 congressional seats, and those don't all equally divide into each other in natural sorts of ways. And so we're trying to pay attention to that. It's one of our things, our good colleague, Commissioner Baker, who's a GIS specialist, has noted to us and shown us on maps where these lines all diverge, and the challenge that then presents for county clerks, among others, as they try and draw precincts. And so we are trying to pay attention to that as we can. The last criteria is that we are to avoid the purposeful favoring or disfavoring of political candidates, potential candidates, incumbents, or political parties. And so one of the decisions that this commission made is that in our map drawing, we are not going to be looking at political data. And so when we draw our maps, we don't know where the independents are, we don't know where the Republicans are, we don't know where the Democrats are. And so we're making our decisions based on these other criteria that we have, the communities of interest, the city and county boundaries, and most importantly, the raw population data, because that's the information that we have to work with. And we have to work with the Senate blocks that have been defined by the Senate, by the census, not the Senate, the census blocks. And those don't always neatly match other definitions that exist. And so we're challenged in doing that. So that gives you some sense of the kind of process that we're going through. Our objective is to present our maps to the state legislature on November 1st. That's the target date that we've had now for some time. And that's in delivering the maps to them. Are there other things that the commission would like to highlight in terms of our process or other issues at this point? Not hearing any, we'll go ahead and proceed to the next item on our agenda, which is Now, it just tells me staff. It doesn't tell me which one of our staff I get to call on today. Okay, yeah. So we've been rotating this presentation to make sure all of our staff have an opportunity to present public. So today, Joy Fika will be doing the staff presentation on how the public can be engaged and to help you see a little bit about navigating our website and the tools that we have available for the public.
Thank you, Commissioner Facer. I just wanted to go over one thing really quick. I know we ran out of some of the city maps out there. If you didn't see a city or a specific county you want, you can scan one of the QR codes on the bottom of that map, and they'll all be there. I just wanted to throw that out there in case you guys didn't get one you saw. If you direct your attention over to this projector up here, I wanted to go over how to use our website and how to get involved with the commission and how to let your voice be heard. So this is our website right here, and there's four main things you can do to submit comments. If you go over here to this participate tab, you can see there's two tabs. I know they're kind of hard to see, but it says map your community and map the state of Utah. And we have a little YouTube video tutorial here for the communities of interest. So if you just have 5 or 10 minutes, maybe you don't want to do the daunting task of mapping the whole state, you can just map your community of interest. So that would be something like a neighborhood or a church group or a school district boundary or something, and say, hey, this is my community, keep it together. You can also map the state of Utah, and we have another video tutorial down here. It's going to take at least 2 hours to learn the software and to map, but those maps are incredibly helpful. If you go back to the participate tab, you can also just submit a public comment here. If you just want to say something specific, you don't want to draw a map, you can also do that here. One of the other ways, now that we have some more draft maps that the commission is doing, is you can go to the main page and you can see the drafted Utah district maps. And you can click on a specific one, for instance, congressional, and you can view all of the commission's draft maps and comment on them. So you can zoom into your city over here. Being a little slow. And the cool thing about this is it lets you stay where you are as you rotate through the map. So you can see what each map does to your community. And if you say, for instance, don't like a map, or you do like a map, you can fill out this comment and make sure to be specific. Say, hey, I really like this map because you kept my community together. Or, hey, I really don't like this map because you split my ward in half, or you split my elementary school district in half. And these are really helpful to the commission because no one knows the community better than the people that live in the community. And so we can get a better idea of what needs to improve on our maps and what needs to change. And like I said, you can do this for the congressional, the state senate, the state house, and the state school board. And the commission sees all of those comments. You can also view all of the other public comments or communities of interest if you're interested. This is an example of all the comments we get. We post here in the effort of transparency. And then you can also view our community of interests. If you go over to this tab, we'll let it load for a minute. And you can see that they're kind of formed in a pancake kind of thing, and you can see where they overlap most often. So you can scroll through economic, educational, environmental, and you can view those communities and see what other public is saying about your area if you're at all interested. So that's our website. You can also go over here to the events, and you can see if you want to say come to one of our meetings remotely, or you want to make it to a different one. All of our events are listed here, and you can find the Zoom links for all of that there. But our website's a really helpful tool. You can get your comment to the commission, you can learn more about us, and you can educate yourself on redistricting. Does anybody have any questions about the website? Okay.
Thank you, Joy. I do want to note that on the mapping, even though Joy said it'll take a couple hours to become familiar with the software and start mapping, don't become overwhelmed. If you get in the middle of drawing a map and you run into some problem, feel free to send a comment to our staff, and they'll get back with you. They're more than willing to help folks that are interested in drawing, whether it's congressional boundaries or even the more time-consuming house maps. We recognize those take some time, and we're happy to try and help folks engage in that process.
Yes, and I just wanted to point out one thing I forgot. The email, it's kind of hard to see there, but you can find it on the business cards out there. It's UIRC.Comments@Utah.GOV. So like Commissioner Facer said, if you run into any issues at all, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. I do want to note that we have several city officials with us today, and we're grateful for their attendance. And we would invite them, along with the public, as we do our public comment, to share their perspectives and tell us, why their communities are important and why we ought to be paying attention to their communities. As we proceed to the public comment portion, I'm going to ask Gordon Haight to describe how that will work.
No, we appreciate you coming out today. I know it's a fun thing to do on a Saturday, but we really do appreciate your comments. We have, and at the end of the public comment, you can come up to any of our staff and they'll show you the website, help you get started on any questions you have. So if you want to participate that way, we'll go ahead and we'll have a little timer. So it's about 5 minutes per person. And we'd love to hear what you have to say.
So we'll go ahead and just open it up. And if you'd like to make a public comment, feel free to come up to the podium. And we'll just assume that we can all be orderly and that we won't push and shove or any other kind of behavior. So we invite you to come and share your comments. I was going to say one of them just stepped out, one of them just stepped back in. So
okay.
But,
Hi, I'm Donna Burnham. I serve on the Eagle Mountain City Council. And I guess for me, the biggest concern that I have is that we've been underrepresented for the last 10 years because we are growing so quickly. And the population data that you have, which I know is what you have to work with, we're already at 50,000. So we're already underrepresented before we even start. And so I would just, any way that you can, I know that you have a little bit of leeway in terms of percentages. So maybe making the district that we're in a little smaller than some of the others might help us because we're just going to continue to grow. And I know there are other areas like that, but Saratoga Springs is another one and they're right next to us. So combining us with Saratoga Springs and then not expecting the same result as last time, we're gonna end up with the same problem. So anything you can do for that, we would appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know, I believe we have the mayor of Fairfield. If you'd like to make a public comment, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Well, I'd like anyone else has to say first. But
You bet. You bet.
I'll follow up with comment. See what.
Terrific. And then I believe the mayor of Eagle Mountain is here in addition to our council members. So we welcome comments from our public officials as well as the general public. So.
Hello, my name is Paul Kelch. I'm just a local resident. I was just wondering if the redistricting is going to affect utilities or infrastructure?
Well, in some ways, it can have some ripple effects because of who ends up representing you. And so that then can affect the way the state sets its rules for doing some of those kinds of things. But it won't directly affect infrastructure or utilities.
Okay, so it's just going through the House district?
That's right.
Okay,
That's right.
thank you.
You bet. Let's say, does anybody have any alternative perspective on that? I'm happy to have to share those.
Hey, my name is Brad Gurney. I'm the mayor of Fairfield, the little town out here to the southwest of us. For me, dealing with the state legislature over the past few years has been a little challenging because we're a rural community, basically. There's not very many of us, but yet we sit in one of the fastest growing counties in the state. And so what happens is, what's happened in the past is we've been kind of tied in with the rural communities because we've been rural, but yet we're surrounded by growth and things coming in. So for me, and I think our community, I think we'd like to be tied a little closer to Eagle Mountain, Saratoga Springs, and Lehigh. The other thing to kind of be aware of for us is all the traffic in all of our communities go through Eagle Mountain, Saratoga Springs, and Lehigh. They don't go through Spanish Fork or Cedar City or anything to the south. They all go north. So history-wise, the kids that grew up here went to Lehigh High School. We've been tied to Cedar Fort. Us and Cedar Fort are pretty closely tied together with our thoughts and thinking and growth standards. So we like to be more tied to what surrounds us rather than be kind of separated out with the rural community. So I think that's all I had to say.
That's very helpful. We appreciate that perspective in part, especially as we look at, for example, Eagle Mountain being this kind of ideal population size for a house district. What then happens to a community like yours, right, in that? And I think that's important for us to be thinking about, that you all see your ties going kind of north and east, more so.
Yeah, more to the north and the east rather than to the south.
Yeah.
And again, we're kind of unique. I'm just going to understand that square miles wise, okay, we're like number 5 in square miles. Okay, we're number 1 as far as population to square mile. I think we were like 6 to every square mile or something. So very, very few population. But as we grow, that will change. And I think our district and our representation should be more with what's going to happen to us in the future than what we currently see today.
Thank you.
Are you expecting growth in the near future, or maybe a decade? Or
we're doing
2 decades
everything we
out?
can to stop it. Keep it as small and rural as we could keep for as long as we can. But we also understand that it's coming. Right? There's just not a lot of places to grow in the state. I mean, Salt Lake Valley is kind of getting filled up. Utah Valley is getting filled up. And if you look at the demographics of Cedar Valley is just as big as Utah Valley is, if not a little bit bigger. There's not really a lot of places to grow other than coming around through Eagle Mountain and then us, and then farther on to the south of us. So I think growth is going to happen whether we want to or not. But for us, we're trying to keep it small, rural communities for just as long as we can hang on to that.
Thank you very much.
Question? Perfect, thanks.
Hi there, I'm Melissa Clark. I serve on the Eagle Mountain City Council. And I'd like to echo the good mayor's comments about how you group us together. For years, we have a precinct in our community, EM09, and it gets lumped together with a seat that comprises mostly of Provo. And that poor little precinct that belongs to our city, it's the White Hills, Pole Canyon area. When we have political events for different party things and whatnot, they're always something completely different. So I think it's crucial, first of all, when you're looking at our city, to make sure that you're not like islanding a precinct on its own, because that is very complicated. But the other thing that I really liked about what he had said was that when we leave our city and we go someplace, none of us are driving to Tooele, except for people who maybe work in Tooele. None of us are driving south along the back roads and down to Delta. We're going through Saratoga, we're going through Lehigh. And as you look at the mapping, our traffic patterns impact each other. Saratoga Springs is completely tied to what happens in Eagle Mountain and vice versa. And I would even say Lehigh too, 2100 North, Mountain View Corridor, all of those things. When we talked about, there was a resident that had a question about utilities and roads and infrastructure funding. It does impact that for the 3 cities to combine together to fight for funding, and that's powerful. Another thing that I would ask is that don't split our city in halves or thirds. We as a city struggle as it is with identity, and because we're so geographically large, that often it's like, what part of city do you live in? And just different labels and whatnot. And I really think that as we grow and we are being asked by the state and the greater community to really shoulder the load when it comes to growth here in our city, especially with Envision Utah and some of those other things that have come out. It's important for us to be able to have a solid, cohesive base as a city. And that goes for our Senate seat and our House seat. So those are the comments that I had for you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Tom Westmoreland, Mayor of Eagle Mountain. I was told that you wanted me to make a couple of comments. I don't have a lot to add, but certainly with Eagle Mountain's concerns and challenges, they are pretty specific in a fast-growing community in a large rural area. And we really feel the target on our backs as far as the growth in the state. We know this is where a lot of it's going to happen. And so it's our responsibility to plan well and get the support that we are going to need. This is where I start talking about, like, regional concerns kind of a thing, and working together, because if we're going to bear the burden of much of the state's growth, then we are going to need the state's assistance, involvement in that. Particularly transportation is going to be huge, right? So now strategizing districts, I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to look at it, and I'm sure that there are pros and cons to all of that. Probably mostly, I would think, the primary growth concerns would probably be a highlight for us. But other than maybe Saratoga Springs, which their growth is going to be limited. I don't know how much longer their growth pattern will continue, but they're going to start filling up sometime in the not distant future, where Eagle Mountain, being one of the geographically one of the larger cities in the state, will continue to grow for some time. And add to that the fact that we are surrounded by county land as well, so there's always potential for annexation. So we could be growing for some time at whatever pace the market dictates and water holds out and things like that. So we expect we'll be tasked with meeting those challenges for some time, and so I'm still trying to learn this districting stuff myself, so I don't have a whole lot of input there. But do you have any questions for me as far as Eagle Mountain is concerned?
Please, Commissioner Hilliard.
Appreciate you coming. I didn't know anything about Eagle Mountain until I came today. I've been drawing maps for about 20 days, about 8 hours a day, trying to figure out this mess. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Commissioner Thorne and I have been working together, and I know we started one district in Utah County, and we realized that was a great mistake, because you can expand the local areas, but when you get to the borders, you can't. For example, Daggett County can only go west or south. They can't go north or east. So we decided to put it together like a jigsaw puzzle and do the outside first, because they couldn't move, and then moving here. And again, being contiguous doesn't mean you can drive from one to the other. In other words, you could put Saratoga Springs with Spanish Fork, because they're hooked up by the lake, or Magna with Tooele, because they over the mountain, but they're contiguous on the map. One of the real challenges I think we have with Utah County and with Eagle Mountain is, if we could take just one district and do it fine, but the trouble, it has to fit.
Right.
And so we may, for example, look at Tooele, and Tooele needs to pick up 10,000 people to make a district. Where to go? We go west, we go north across, south, or go across the water or into Box Elder County, we go over the mountain, or do we come back in here? Where's the natural ties of that would be? For example, when we do congressional districts, we have to have 817,904. We can be off about 800 either way. So in other words, it's pretty close to get that exactly. And the other difficult thing with that is if, say, you're 500 short on District 1, 502, 503, then you've got to be 1,500 on 4, because we can't leave a pace out. Everything's got to be, and that then violates our rules, and we have to go back and do that. House districts, a little more fluctuation, because it's really hard. Now, Commissioner Thorne and I we went through and did everything just on the numbers. So we probably ended up cutting Eagle Mountain into 5 ways. I'm just saying, I don't know. But we just, on a map, we had no idea other than just the numbers. There are what's called census blocks. And a census block may show 150 people, it may show 0. In the mountains, it may show 20. But that census block doesn't really often fit your city boundaries. And so we use these census blocks, and that's kind of screwed too. So when we got through, Commissioner Thorne and I went back and said, okay, now what cities have we cut? Let's try to put cities back together. Because oftentimes we can go 1 block north or 1 block south, as long as we pick up 150 people. It doesn't matter to us which way. So we've tried very hard. One thing I've learned, people have screwy city boundaries. I mean, somebody looks like a spider, and you say, I'm sure that when we do this, somebody's going to go, aha, he's gerrymandering to get that area. No, everybody's just trying to keep city boundaries together. So my question to you is as we look at Eagle Mountain, it's an ideal situation just there. In the context of everybody around you, it probably doesn't fit just exactly there. So the question really is, and I think I got that from the mayor of Fairfield, you'd rather bring those east than go south down to Payson or go west over to Willa County, because that's where your more natural flow is.
Right, it certainly is a transportation flow and a commerce connection as well, you know, where everyone works and shops and travels. So probably until we get a freeway that wraps around goes through Cedar Valley, wraps around the south end of the lake, there probably won't be natural ties that way. But certainly, one of the challenges that we all have here, both internally and externally, because there are many people like yourself that, don't make it out this way a lot. And so frequently it's hard to keep up with the growth numbers. So we're growing at just averaging about 5,000 people a year. So the numbers, usually by the time you get a report, it's outdated. So it's just happening that fast.
Let me give you something else to think about. For Congress, it doesn't matter where you live. You can run for any congressional seat you want, regardless of where you, as long as you live in Utah. So we have a number of congressmen who have been elected not from their district where they actually lived. But for the Senate and the House and the school board, you have to live in your district. Say, for example, we were to split Eagle Mountain. So now you have 23,000 on one side and 23, something like that. In theory, you could get 2 legislators elected. And you can, in theory, have 2 people living in Eagle Mountain.
That sounds like good representation.
And other areas. So when people come to me and say, oh no, we got to keep us all together. We had this discussion in Cedar City, they were 37,000. I said, nah, you may want to have large enough districts that you could actually have 2. And they were really quite interested in that. So it's not that we're trying to punish here or whatever, it's just numbers are killing it. Community of interest, Rob and I were just talking about that. That's really kind of hard to define. We were in Heber City. We had the mayor of Park City say, we don't want to be tied into the east part of Summit County. That's totally different than we are. And somebody else stood up and said, now, wait a minute. We are quite a bit together. We ought to be together. So community interest can be a pretty subjective kind of thing trying to put together. But obviously, you want somebody representing you who understands Eagle Mountain issues. So in the legislature, there's an argument about where do we fund roads, or where do we fund water, or where do we fund those projects? That person knows because they live here. And that's what we're really trying to do with these districts. 43,000, we can have some variance of that, but every time we cut one down, we have to add to somebody else because it's got to come out equal when we get to the end. How we got the numbers, we took the census population and divided by 75. And that came out to 43,000, whatever the figure was. So that's how it started. But I don't know the lines. I didn't know until I passed over that. What's that called? That pass?
Unity pass.
Yeah, Unity pass. That you were divided. I had no idea. And
Well, that division is lessening, all the time. It was more felt in years past than it is now. But yeah.
And I don't know whether your projected growth would be more on the east or on the west. I have no
Well,
idea.
we've just about fulfilled all of our growth on the east, and so it's going to start coming to this. Well, it already is. This is the future growth right here in this part of the city. Well, I don't envy your task. It's a tough one, but an interesting one too. Particularly, when you're talking about representation and lobbying for funding. So, do you get more mileage out of one or two representatives, for example?
Well, I found that Utah County legislators are pretty loyal to the whole area. So even though you may have a legislator living in Provo, I've found they're pretty loyal to everywhere in the county. They don't like Utah, Salt Lake County, but they like Utah.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you. Are there other public comments? We'd love to hear.
I don't know what you might.
No, that'd be fun.
This isn't so much a comment as far as Valley. I just want to say I appreciate what you guys are doing and the approach that you guys are taking. You guys really have a hard job of putting it together. And I really appreciate just listening to how you guys are looking at districting and your comments just now, how it goes together. And it helps me appreciate a little bit more why it may happen, end up the way it ends up. And it's too bad that other people in the Valley don't get to hear all those comments and know, because you're right, when you get done, people are going to whine one way or the other, but you guys just have a hard job. I just want to say thank you for what you're doing and appreciate your approach that you're taking to it and your honesty about it. And thanks for what you do.
They'll always whine to the negative. I don't think too many people will whine to the positive.
That's true. So, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Please, Commissioner Bishop.
Look, you guys have told us the most significant thing we need is if you're combined with some other area, which area to go to. And you've been all very clear in that, so thank you. And I have a great deal of empathy for your problem as far as where the growth is and what the future looks like. Unfortunately, you are stuck with the number that happened in April of 2020. Whether you like it or not, that's it. I think that the term before Lyle came in the legislature, we did have a concept that didn't go very far, but it was unconstitutional tax limitation in which local spending growth would have to have directly proportioned to the population you had. So we did have a motion by your predecessor actually to move Logan City from a population that was like 23,000 in the census to officially 28,000 for the purposes of revenue growth, which was, it's amazing where you actually saw a legislative body trying to change the official population of the district by a voice vote in the House. It didn't go very far because we don't have the ability of doing that. So it's always in a high growth area, it's always going to be, you're playing a catch-up game. And I think we all empathize with that. And if indeed we can, there are some flexibility on House and Senate legislative districts. I think we can look at that. However, it is very clear also what Lyle said, and having two is better than one if you want to play the game properly. But our goal has always been to try and maintain the integrity of community boundaries, as strange as those boundaries actually are with some of the cities here, not mentioning any names. However, in the travel, I had to come from Provo last night here today. The way I took the roads, I think UDOT has the same problem with their roads. If I see Gazelle Run one more time, there are multiple ways of looking at that, and we empathize with you with that. But the most important way is when you have to be combined, how do you want to go? And you were very clear and specific with that. We appreciate that.
I just add, I kept looking for the sign saying you've now entered Nevada.
Thank you. Any further public comments? Not hearing any, I'll go ahead and close the public comment portion of our meeting. And we'll now move on to some commission business. We have a couple of additional items on our agenda for today.
Can I just say one thing,
Yes.
one thing more that is totally inappropriate?
When did that stop?
Yeah, now you're testing it.
Yeah, now this is, I just want to say how happy I am. I have never been to Eagle Mount before, but I realize it's the home of one of the congresspersons that I had the greatest respect for, who went back there, and her goal was not to be a prima donna, her goal was to be a good congressperson. And she put that in this, the effort always impressed me. So I'm happy to be and finally be able to see where she actually lived for a while. So I'm that more than anything else, I'm happy to be here. So thank you. Thank you for hosting us.
And we are very grateful for your hosting us and to have such a nice facility as you have to meet in. We really do appreciate that. So we want to move on to start talking about some map refinements. And this is perhaps where the rubber starts to hit the road and it starts to become really challenging. But one of the issues around our map refinements is that we will eventually have to deliver a set of 12 maps, 3 of each type of map to Congress, Senate, House, and State School Board to the state legislature. And that process is one that, on the one hand, one it would I think pretty straightforward, but there have been complexities arising lately. Oh, Commissioner Thorne joined us as well. Oh, wonderful. So we now have Commissioner Bill Thorne with us as well. So we really appreciate having both of them online with us, especially as we start talking a little bit about refining maps. But I do want to, we have an issue that I don't know whether it would be better to talk about it now on our target of submitting maps to the legislature, or if that would be better after our refinement discussion. Any thoughts from council?
I prefer to chair on that. Maybe afterwards. I think it probably has less interest or pertinence to those 3 years. So I'd suggest doing that after the refinement discussion.
Perfect. We'll have that discussion after we talk about refinement. So all of you have received a stack of maps, I hope, and hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming for the public. Just this is a stack of maps that we received, the printout of the maps that we've drawn, as well as the maps that the public has drawn, for us to start reviewing them, as well as being able to look at them online, so that we can start making refinements. I know that we've also received today some additional documents to go with those maps on district splits for our state Senate seats, as well as state House maps as well. Do we have any additional kind of overview issues from staff?
No, just we're meeting with the Clerks Association on Tuesday, just to be a part of that. And we would like to give them a proper number of maps. That's one of our, and we're also working with the State School Board, and they're looking at our maps as well. So we want to give them the fewest number of maps that they have to look at. So that's a really important driving back to why they're trying to do that.
So as you all looked at the set of maps that you received, I guess the place to start is what stands out to you on, and let's start with the congressional maps. What stands out to you? What do you want to focus on as we try and winnow these down to 3 maps? Thoughts?
Overwhelmed with all the comments. Well, let me make a comment if I can. I think we have been driven mainly on congressional districts of very little deviation. And in the legislature 10 years ago, when they drew those 4 maps, they ended up with them all equal except for the Bishop district. He had 1 extra. And I know there's a lot of criticism about it because some of them times they'd go down in a town that divide streets out and that, and it was all being driven not by where people lived, driven by the actual getting number 1. They're down to equal population. Now, the several we turned in, I don't have it right in front of me now. I know in Congress, we got it down to pretty even. And the issue really gets to be, we got ours, Commissioner Thorne and I got ours deviation down to very low. I think it's 6 and 7. And we could probably go back and get that straightened out too if you really want us to. But it looks really strange on the map to do it that way. I think one of the key things is we've got to present, and this is the rule. I think people need to understand the fact that under the Utah Constitution, the legislature does reapportionment. We do not. The statute created an independent agency to make a recommendation. So our role, and again, we've tried to do that by not looking where incumbents live, not looking at political data at all, but just looking at the criteria we've talked about. And we will very shortly, and this is what you're talking about, submit maps to the legislature that under the statute, they need to review and then either say yes or no, and if no, why they haven't adopted them. But one issue that I think is really important for us is although we can talk about our deviation levels, I don't think we ought to be any greater deviation than the legislative staff of what they said. So the legislature staff has set the deviation, but they don't want to deviate more than 10 people per district. Then I think if we do more than that, even though technically it may be legal, I think that's basis for the legislature to say, you've expanded what we set, our criteria, because under the US Supreme Court decision, it's 1 man per 1 vote. And that's really the ultimate binding thing that we have, and how much you can deviate from that is, I think we said it's safe if it's what?
Well, the number that we have is a 0.2% overall range. And that actually came from the Legislative Redistricting Committee.
Okay.
So that was the outer bound that the committee set, but we don't know if since then they've had a working number that is less than that.
Yeah. What's the number?
So the number is 817 plus or minus.
Okay, so we can be 817 above or 870 below, as long as we come out equal in the end.
Yes.
Got to have everybody in the district. So I think that is a criteria that we need to manage. And we go below that, I think the better off we're going to be as far as the Legislative Legal Counsel looking at our work and what they recommend at the Legislative Redistricting Commission as to whether we quote unquote have a legal map. And I think when we get things turned into us, and obviously when they violate the 800 people one way or the other, I don't think we really need to take much time to do it, to read it, because we know that under the criteria of the legislature, under 1 man, 1 vote, it'll be rejected. So that's really a criteria I think we need to do. I think other than that, and when you look at the Senate and the House and the school districts, they're a little bit broader. We can have more discretion, but I know Commissioner Thorne and I have worked very hard, probably 3 days, going through our house map, looking at the cities, and really was difficult in Utah County when you have Saratoga Springs, Eagle Mountain, Lehigh, all kind of tied in together, and it's really hard to separate them out. And again, I've indicated, what do you do with Tooele when they need to pick up 1,000 or 10,000 people? Where do you get those from? And it has to come probably out of this area, and then you go into the areas of northern Utah County, and those towns are all border to border right next to each other. So it's hard to, if you need to pick up 500 people, you have to go into another town to get it, and in that criteria. So I would like to, first, if we're going to do the congressional maps, I'd like to look, first of all, the criteria that we clearly are within the 400 or 800 up or down. And first of all, and secondly, the closer we can get to 0 on those, the better. That'd be my recommendation.
Okay. I know Congressman or Commissioner Bishop, you have some sentiments on the deviation thresholds.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, I've said them all before. If we have a deviation that's more than 1 hand, we are inviting a lawsuit. not for us, but for the legislature. In which case, I think the legislature would be wise, just forget what we've given them, because that brings a lawsuit. That's why they work so hard on every session we've had for the last 40 years to have a deviation of 1. It's the difference between every congressional district. So the deviation is extremely significant on congressional. Doesn't matter that much on the state or the school boards. You can have some variance there, but on the congressional ones, if you want to have the state have to fund through a court case, go as highest hand, that'll still be sued. The deviation becomes significant. We also have to send 3 maps to the legislature. I would hope that the 3 maps would have 3 different philosophical bases to it. There are a whole lot of special interest groups that are hoping or trying to get this commission to come up with something that benefits that special interest groups, although they'll mask the way they are saying it. But if we have 3 different approaches to it, I think when we give the best opportunity of doing something. As you always know, I am insisting that an urban-rural mix in all 3 districts is essential for the state of Utah. For every time I have the congressional delegation, I want 4 people fighting for a rural issue for Utah and 4 people fighting for an urban issue. We can't guarantee by lines what an individual will do. But if we draw a line that has urban and rural together, you have a greater propensity of having 4 people voting for common interests of both urban and rural in the state. If we actually have only an urban area or a rural district, we have added the propensity of allowing that person to do only urban and forget the rural, or only rural and forget the urban. And that is the tragic history of the state of Utah for the past 40 years. We should learn from that. But that urban-rural mix, I think, is essential if we're going to do something good for Congress, and I mean good for the state of Utah and Congress. And I'm sorry, I'm talking about personal history with that. But in regard to that, we're going to have 3 maps. I would expect 3 different philosophical statements would be the wisest thing for us to do, as opposed to finding 3 maps that simply mirror each other.
Okay, thank you.
And deviation 5 or less.
Mr. Chair,
Please.
thank you. Just relating to the deviation, and I certainly sense our wonderful colleague, Commissioner Bishop's passion about that very, very small deviation. And I just have a question, and perhaps our legal counsel could also opine. But when we have adopted, and also the legislature has adopted, that 1% or 0.1% deviation, I'm just wondering how that still, I guess, presents the possibility of a lawsuit if we have, or the legislature has fallen within that 0.1% deviation and hasn't gone above that. So meaning that it could technically be within those 800 numbers. I know that there's been such great effort to get down to these, 2, 1, 3 person deviation between these different districts. But if we are still falling within that accepted 0.1 deviation for criteria, I'm just wondering what the possibility is for a lawsuit.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I think what might be helpful for the commission, we've had this discussion before, the National Conference of State Legislatures has on their website from 2010 a chart that shows a deviation for all congressional districts as well as House, State, and House Senate. And I think to Commissioner Bishop's point, what you're going to see is the majority of those deviations are less than 5. They're very close for most states that have sought to get that within 1 person, that ideal population. And that, I think, has been obviously the goal and what the Supreme Court says the ideal is, and that's been also the practical reality. You'll notice on that list that there are a handful of states that have gone beyond that small number, and the largest, I guess, in 2010, if I remember correctly, was West Virginia, And that was a number of thousands. So there was over 1,000 deviation. There was litigation on that one. The Supreme Court did uphold and say there was justification. It was within the appropriate bounds under the Constitution, but there was a lawsuit with that. As far as the other deviations, I can't say how many of those actually resulted in a lawsuit. But your point's well raised. Under the law and what the Supreme Court, what we've seen thus far is that any deviation of 1% in Congress thus far has been held, at least by some cases, to be acceptable under certain circumstances. Now, I think the Utah Legislative Committee was wise to say, well, look, that's really the outer bounds. They, in their criteria, said we're going to shoot for a plus or minus 0.1%. So an overall range of 0.2%. But your point's well taken. Is if their idea was, hey, we really just want this to be 10 people or 20 people, so 0.001 or 4, you know, they certainly could have done that. So it's hard to say exactly, you know, how they're going to approach any map that is within the 0.1% deviation that they've set as saying, hey, it needs to be there. Now, historically and practically, I think what we've seen, especially with Utah last time, is that they got that down to 1. And I, from all accounts and conversations that I've had, I think that's still the goal of the legislature to do that. And so I don't know if I have an exact answer for you, because you have this legal question of, okay, what is required under the Constitution, and that's under a 1%. We've even narrowed that to a 0.1 up or down. Would that result in a lawsuit or not? Who can say? But I think all intentions I getting from a practical, it might even be a more practical consideration as opposed to a legal consideration for that. I know I apologize, I'm not giving you a concrete answer. I just don't know if there really is a specific answer, because what the facts that we know them are the legislative committee said, hey, here's our range. And so we take that at face value of, they say you're within the range if it's 0.1% up or down. But I think there's also a practical reality and historical reality that even though they have set this range, I get the sense that they're looking for something likely more in the range that the Commissioner Bishop has said. And so it's a difficult balance there. And I guess a decision the commission has to say, if you have strong feelings and reasons why, hey, for this one, we're beyond, 10 or 20 or 100 or even 400 people, you're within that range. So it would be under the statute and would comply with the statute and be legal in that respect. But then it's the practical question of whether they're going to maybe weigh that or view that in a way that, that they wouldn't want to approach. Clear as mud. I apologize. I really wish I could give you a more clear answer. And we do have this interesting scenario where they've given a range that I've seen some of the maps are within that range. But there still is this concern of, even though you're technically meeting that, is that something that the legislature is still going to say, well, we're actually looking more for something in the 0 to 10 people as opposed to the 0.1.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, so, and I'm certainly respectful too of Commissioner Bishop's experience and his perspective. And I'm just trying to figure out, I guess, just the logic, because we do have actually the purple team maps go above that. The other teams have really been very disciplined in their number. And so I'm just trying to understand, I think there are certainly good arguments for going over a bit, just because, we have those numbers. We know that Eagle Mountain certainly has grown by at least 7,000 since those numbers were taken in April of 2020, but we have those 2020 numbers to work with. That's what we are tasked to do, is to work with those 2020 numbers. But let's say that there's a city or an area that has a congressional size of, we have the 218,904, and let's say there are 218,920 people right there. Are we going to split that there? Cut off the 10 plus people because we want to stay within that specific range, that target range of maybe 1 to 2 people. And so how do we balance that when, that would be certainly breaking up a community right there. And so would you argue that those extra 10 people should be part of that congressional district? So anyway, I'm just trying to come to terms with it. And I certainly appreciate everybody's perspective and just wanting to know. But I think, I guess just personally, as I look at it too, just the other criteria that we have set where we're really trying to be aware of communities of interest and also to try to keep communities together, to try to even keep neighborhoods together. So we're not splitting one house, apart from the house next door because we want to get within that one person deviation. So
May I speak to that just briefly?
Please, and then Commissioner Durham has comments.
Great. You raise a great point, and I think that is an example of where you saw perhaps some of the larger deviations in other states is where they decided, look, this is that type of situation. We've done our best, but we now have a city that it came down to the decision of, do we carve off a certain number and put them in a separate district or keep that city whole? And what the Supreme Court has said, and is what's required, is you just better be sure that there's no other way to get it down to 0 by keeping that whole and doing some other things. If you're going to say that criteria then is going to justify going then beyond, say, a very small number of deviation. And that's what's happened in some areas, and it either wasn't challenged, or if it was challenged, it's been upheld because in those situations where the court determined, hey, you had a really good reason to go a little higher than this. And nobody has come forward with a way that you could satisfy that reason without, coming at least with that type of deviation. And so that's really what you see with all these cases is if you have a deviation and someone wants to challenge it, they can say, look, I can satisfy your need. I can keep that city whole as well as all the other cities whole and still get it down to 0. Then you're in trouble. And then I don't think, the court's going to look favorably on you going beyond. Now, the reason you're probably doing that is you've exhausted all your other areas and you realize, look, we're really down to this. And it's a question of, do we carve out 100 people or not? And we're certain, and you're saying, we think it's more important for that city to be held whole. Those generally either aren't challenged or the court says, yeah, that's fine if it is challenged. You just have to be very sure that there's no other way to satisfy your goal of that criteria of keeping things whole and still getting it down to 0. So that's kind of the legal framework that we're dealing with. And are there situations, and is there something in your map that if you feel like, look, that's what it's come down to, then in my view, from a legal standpoint, I think you're on solid footing. It still raises the question from a practical standpoint of how the legislative committees can review that. And that I just can't answer for you. But that's kind of the legal framework as I understand it.
Thank you. Commissioner Durham.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Whoops. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the discussion on deviations. That's very helpful and educational. I wanted to make a comment about a part of other another part of Commissioner Bishop's earlier comments. I know he's a very strong advocate of the approach, and I understand his rationale, the approach of having rural and urban areas in similar congressional districts. I started out feeling somewhat persuaded by his arguments, but I have to say, and I just want to put it on the table. First of all, I think his suggestion of sort of choosing representative maps that offer a choice is a very useful one. But I also want to say that I no longer share the view that it is practicable. Well, it's practicable in the sense that you can do it, but I don't think it's practical in terms of the way it works for the citizens of Utah to combine extraordinarily rural areas, such as we find throughout the state, and extremely urban areas. I've commented before, and of course it's still true, that Salt Lake City, that the Wasatch Front is one of the most urban areas in the country if you measure it by the number of individuals the percentage of individuals in the state who live in it. So you have this extreme urban area, and then you have very extreme rural areas. And my sense has come to be, and this is based on the comments that I have seen throughout the written comments and some of the comments presented at our open meetings, which are really object to that notion that it's good for the state, let alone good for congressional districts and individual citizens to be represented in the way that I realize Commissioner Bishop would prefer. I think, we're focusing so much on communities of interest in the context of other districting, but I think we also have to consider communities of interest in the statewide context, and realize that urban dwellers, while they care about all of Utah's issues, and rural dwellers, while they care about all of Utah's issues, nonetheless have priorities. And I think one of the highest priorities for our map should be, among other things, districts that are competitive districts, and districts that set priorities based on the nature of the life that people in them live. So I just wanted to get that on the table. We'll hash that out, when we get to the individual maps. But that's where I have shifted from where I started, as a total neophyte mapping districts, and to the point where we are now, looking at public comments and the raising of issues by our citizens. And this is all to say that I hate the green map we did on congressional districts. But again, we'll hash that out when we get to the maps. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, you may.
Let me try and put a little bit of perspective on the one man, one vote issue. The assumption is that all congressional districts are the same size. That simply is not the case. It has to be one man, one vote within a state. So in 2000, when we were up for a 4th congressional seat and we lost it to North Carolina, my congressional district was about 570,000 people. North Carolina's congressional districts were 430,000 people. Montana didn't make it to 2 seats, so they had 900,000 in their congressional district. So the size of congressional districts vary all over the place. It's just within a state boundary. That's where we have to have the one man, one vote. And that's where the one man, one vote issue becomes extremely credible. And the issue, once again, is not if you can defend something, is why defend anything in the first place when you don't have to. And we've already had maps presented here in which you can get down to those numbers.
Sure. Now,
We're stuck.
I would like to raise an issue on the deviations, however. We have this new effort by the census this year on differential privacy, where they have move people from where they actually live to some other place to try and protect people's privacy. Well, one of the things that has happened, for example, in the Utah, in the Provo Town Center Mall, so in the block that is only the Provo Town Center, there are 29 people living in the mall. And so I worry about I understand the getting to zero, but I worry about the reality of that zero if it is that we've got 29 people living in a place like the mall, and that's not the only place where we have people living where there aren't housing units. But I think, now, philosophically, I think we ought to have a map that is approaching zero on the deviation. But from that notion of alternative philosophies, I think having a map that says we recognize that because of differential privacy, that the getting to zero is somewhat meaningless even within the state. That having slightly larger deviations would be reasonable. But anyway, that's one of the things that's been running through my head as we've been thinking about this. And as I see some of those anomalies, like the 29 people.
So you're saying that 29 is too low for the number of homeless people living in the mall?
If we're homeless people living in Salt Lake, I'd say yes, but we're not seeing them at the Provo Mall unless I'm there at the wrong time. So
I'd like to add, we may be safe in litigation by doing deviation. We may be able to prove that this was unique and this, that. I don't want to have litigation. It's costly. It takes time. We're under a time thing that the legislature needs to adopt these new districts before the 1st of January. They've got to be effective before the 1st of January, because January 1st is when people start getting petitions signed to run. And if we're in litigation, I have a limited experience in litigation as it doesn't go fast. And we may be tied up in litigation for several years. And I think the mere fact that we've come up with maps that have been pretty close to zero shows it can be done.
Yeah.
I was told by legal counsel for the legislature that in 2010, there were groups that looked at suing the Utah legislative redistricting, and their legal counsel, the top that they could find, said, when you're that close, there's nothing to litigate. I mean, we're wasting your time on that figure. Because I'm sure if I found one town that had 100 people that was outside, I can put them back in and find some other place along the line that I can put 100 out. I mean, that's the type of thing you really have to do. And so I say that, but let me tell you, my concern, again, I say I'm rural from Logan. It's not very rural anymore. But if you do it, you can take a district from the Utah County area, basically. You can, and with part of Salt Lake, you can take Salt Lake, you can take the Davis and Weber County, and you can have 3 congressional districts. What's left over? All of rural Utah. And you've heard, this group hasn't, but you've heard me in other meetings. That means I can go to Grouse Creek, if you even know where that is, in northwest Utah. At Grouse Creek, drive to Manila, drive down to Blanding, and then over to someplace in St. George, and then drive home again. And I can guarantee you, if you don't leave the state of Utah, you cannot do that in one day. So now we're saying we make one legislator who represents rural Utah, and I'll tell you, the issues are totally different on rural issues in say, Cache Valley with our farming units, and oil and gas over in the basin, and the Native American issues in the San Juan area. They're totally different. And so what you really do is say in compactness, we're going to have these 3 districts. You really say the 4th district, you just may as well, who in the world can ever cover and represent all the conflicts of interest there. So I'm really sold to the position that you need to combine both of them. Share this story. I was appropriations chairman when Geneva Steel went down and Kennecott went down. The state of Utah lost about 20% of its income tax that one year. And income tax is used to fund public education across the state. So I guess if I lived in Logan, I could say, ha ha, too bad to you in Jordan School District, you lost Kennecott. But we lost income tax money that went to Logan. And St. George lost it and all those. And so we worked together as a state to solve that problem. Now, to me, the two greatest issues we have on a national level is keeping Hillfield going. Hillfield is a major source of income to our state. And I think the net public lands issue, what I hear, 66% of the public lands belong to the federal government. And we need legislators, at least in Congress, who can, on that issue, work, I think, together to solve the problem. And I think you need to have, congressional people. I think there's enough community of interest in just the general state of Utah in Hillfield and the foreign and in public lands that we're justifying having that and having districts that can represent. My biggest concern when they did the one in 2010, they did this. I was concerned that we'd end up with 4 congressmen out of Salt Lake. I was really concerned that was going to happen because Salt Lake had enough of the areas there that they could have working together, especially where that's the money, that's where the well-known people are, that they could have worked together and controlled all 4 of those congressional. That's a risk you take when you spread. Of course, they don't have to live in their district, and that takes a little bit to change it too. But I'm really convinced, and I like the idea. I don't want to prioritize. I think we ought to send 3 maps. They can be different if you want, but I think to give the legislature a flavor. But I think the districts that we've got down to near 0 will be very compelling if the legislature does something other than that, from somebody litigating, even though they may be 50 over, and saying, look, this committee out there got them down to 0. Yeah.
Well, just for the record, though.
Yeah.
On Lyle's comments, because it's my area, it's Grouse Creek. It's Grouse Creek. We don't say creek, it's creek.
I've been there. I know where it is.
Well, I am personally quite persuaded by not having the ring of the quasi, and I'll still call it a quasi-rural district because you've still got the urban population in Logan, the urban population in St. George, and so you still have these urban issues that are quite dominant. But for me, as I think about the maps, as I've been looking over them, part of what I've been trying to think is how can I take the comments that I've heard from across the state and make sense of them. Whether it be the folks in St. George saying that they really didn't want to be with Salt Lake, but they'd rather be with Utah County. They'd rather not be with anybody, but we all know that they've got to be with somebody, right? And so trying to think about the philosophies that might drive our different map selections, I think is a useful kind of exercise for us. I don't know what other thoughts that some of you have had on that issue in particular. I know one of the things that I've heard from folks is the municipal and county split, minimizing those is a philosophy driving the maps. What else?
I'd also like to know, one of the legal requirements we have is to try and keep the cores together. Just because we don't want to is not necessarily meaning that that's still not one of the legal obligations that we should look at.
Yeah. And I agree, and I really appreciate that staff gave us some data on that on the map. That was very helpful on that. Councilor.
This has been a great discussion, and I just wanted to add a little context to that as well, because I'm really glad the commissioners are thinking about that. We've worked hard to try to lay that out, and we've seen from day one with this process, and I think Commissioner Bishop's comment about, look, we have these other criteria. That's what makes this so challenging, is the commission has statutory criteria to consider and adopt and do its best to accommodate that the legislative committee does not. And so one thing that I think trying to keep everything, avoid any challenges from, there's also something to keep in mind, and an issue from the commission standpoint, that if we were to draw a map that divided up every prior core district, cut them right in half, divided up every city, but got to 0 from the Congress, a distinction, that in my view would still create tons of problems from a challenge as to, they're not saying that there would be a legal challenge to the commission on that. But what I can foresee as an issue there is, look, you have all these statutory things to consider and do your best to comply with and adhere to, such as not dividing up cores of private districts, keeping cities and towns whole. That if you were to grade out an F on all of those, but still got to 0, that to me is problematic. And that wouldn't say, oh, you can't sue, or this couldn't be a challenge to your process, because someone could come forward and say, look, I can still get to 0 by at least keeping the cores of the prior districts together, or keeping cities and towns together, and that type of issue. So numbers are absolutely critical, and I don't want to understate that. What makes it even more difficult for you is you now have all this list of other criteria that if you were completely to ignore it, the numbers isn't going to give you a safe haven, in my view. And that's not what's been done. It's not, in looking at the maps, there's been so much time and effort and thought that the commission is trying to obviously adhere as best possible to account for all these criteria, which is challenging. And I guess in just trying to keep the commission aware of what other challenges could be, I think the point that the possibility is, a scenario where a map, even though at 0, if it violates all these others, a map that grades out, an A with respect to keeping prior districts together, not cutting cities, but then goes over by, 75 people. To me, that's an interesting question as well. What is the more legally defensible map? And from a commission standpoint, given all the criteria that you're having to look at, I think there's a strong argument that says, well, the one that gets an A on all of these criteria and is still within that deviation, there's a good argument to make that that's the better map and more legally defensible. We then obviously have the situation with the legislative committee, though, they don't have those criteria. And so it really puts this tension and at an odds. And so what I just wanted to add, hopefully, to that discussion from a legal standpoint, because I think everything you're saying is right. It's just in a context of a very messy and sticky situation that when you then try to overlay it of where it's going, it creates even more problems. So I hope that's helpful on that. I don't know if it was. And I also had an issue with respect to the deadlines. I don't know if now would be a good time to address it, or we could do that after the.
I think let's do that in a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, great. Happy to do that. Thank you.
Commissioner Durham, did you have another comment? I thought I saw you raise your hand.
Yes, I did. I'm sorry. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to prolong this, but some of the comments we've shared have triggered some other thoughts on a couple of things that were mentioned. One of which is the notion that core districts is a value that we should examine, should be a high priority. Concerns me in that the creation of this commission, I think, is predicated on a widely held public view that redistricting in the past has not been ideal for the state of Utah. And so if I'm right about that, and I'm looking to the history of it, relying on core districts too heavily might handicap what was at least initially seen as our mission. The other thing I wanted to refer to is that, I've lived in Utah for 50 years. I lived in Salt Lake all of that time. I've seen a lot of elections. I've seen the way they've been managed, and I've seen the way what their outcomes have been, and I have seen the results in Congress of those outcomes. And I find it very hard to be an adherent of the view that the statewide commitment of congressional representatives is completely dependent on where they come from. I can't imagine that anyone elected from the Salt Lake area versus anyone elected from the Logan area would not be as equally interested in public land and conservation issues. Now, they might have widely different views on that, but that's the competitive part of democracy and politics. So I'm thinking, and taxes and funds for public education. No congressman or senator from the state of Utah is not going to care deeply about those issues and how they affect the entire state. Likewise, water, agriculture, air quality, infrastructure, growth management. You may be more educated on particular parts of the state, but surely a congressional delegation, if it's going to operate in a cooperative way, is going to educate each other about those problems. So I'm just following up on a couple of points that illustrate my evolution and thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Durham. Other thoughts, perspectives, members of the commission? It seems, as I'm hearing, we have clearly a need to rely on the numbers. We can't ignore them. But there is some question as to whether all of our maps should have a deviation near zero. I'm hearing, at least in my mind, I'm hearing a very reasonable argument that we ought to at least have a map, if not more, that has deviations, that are approaching zero. But I'm also hearing that we have to balance the other criteria that we have, and we can't simply choose to ignore any of the criteria. We may choose to have them be not as high a priority, but we can't completely ignore them. And so I think that becomes part of the challenge for us, is we start thinking about those individual criteria. And I don't know that we necessarily need to walk through them one by one and say, okay, I want to value this one at 90%, this one at 80%. If we did that, we could have a mathematical calculation that would tell us which of the maps it graded out the best. And I don't know that that puts us in a productive place necessarily. So with that, I guess I'm looking for kind of the sense of the commission on the set of maps that we have. For many of the map drawing teams, I guess would be the starting place. Is there a specific map that you want to make sure gets due consideration as we start to winnow the number of maps down?
Can we bring them up on screen and review?
Yeah.
Might that be helpful?
Let me make a suggestion, because I think if we all seven get together and try to put one map together, it'd be like a camel is a horse created by a committee. May I recommend that each of us, our committees, go back and have 3 criteria for our maps. We may want to do just one, we may want to try all 3. One will be very clearly urban, and then some rural area. We've had some submitted that way by the public. Another one may be is having each of the districts have rural and urban together. I know the one I worked hard on Orange 2 is that way. The third one is we could do one that may do kind of halfway between, that there are two districts. Obviously, you're going to have urban in whatever rural districts you have. That's just the numbers. But maybe have 2 districts that are more, the rurals are more 50-50, and that's probably going to be the southern, because you look at the big expanse of southern Utah that has to come into these areas, and then 2 being more urban oriented, so that we have 3 different forms of maps. And I think that goes with what Commissioner Bishop said of having philosophy, and see if we can come to have each of the 3 of us, each of the 3 groups work on our maps. We got to do it quickly. We don't have much time, and then submit it to the whole council and talk about.
Don't we already have that?
Could do.
We already, and the maps have already presented out there. We have some that are urban only, rural only. We have some, well, I'm sorry, I don't know if my two compatriots don't like green one anymore, but a green one is perfect.
That's the problem.
It's perfect, has the numbers right, and it has the basis that's there, and it's urban and rural. But there can be, we have 3 maps. So let's go with 3, and I think we've already got them. Staff, why don't you just pick out 3 and then hash that out, and maybe, well, let's look at maybe 6. And then hash out the 3 that have that, and then go from that. Send one to the legislature, they can throw away at whim.
If they dare.
Well, if we send them 3, they have to throw away 2, even in the best circumstances. And if they're all crappy, they'll throw all 3 of them away, so let's go from there.
Yeah, I worry they might throw out even good ones, so, yeah.
Are we looking to get down to 3 right now?
I know it would be nice to, have only 3 coming out of today, but I don't know, hearing the discussion, I think I do want people to have a chance to reflect on that. And reflect as much as anything, not necessarily just on the map that your team drew, because I think many of us have been doing that, right? We've gone back, we've tweaked it and whatnot. But I think more importantly, to reflect on the maps of the other teams, to say, okay, I really like Orange 2 or Orange 3, and or I really like the public submission by John or Mary or whomever. So, but we need to get that done post haste, which I think is part of the issue you're getting at.
Yeah, and I know I'm probably the one that's been harping the most about getting down to 3 maps. I know the map that Christine and Rob and I did better than the other 2 teams. And I would like a little more time to review other teams. Same with the other teams' plans, proposals.
But can we have staff? I mean, we have 4 who we're looking at for the school board.
Yeah.
Can we have staff pick up the things we've talked about in criteria, come up with like 6 we can look at that are different and all that, and you're right, we got to start whittling it down sometime pretty soon.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I agree. As all the commissioners have said, I mean, we're running against time. And so, but I do want to say as we hone these maps down and as we make these selections, and I like the suggestion that you had, Commissioner Bishop, about, having different representations of different philosophies as be the, those are what we will present to the legislature. But I do want to say, just as an aside, just to remind everybody that that we still have several public hearings to go. And so I just want to make it clear to the public that even as we are making selections from all of the maps that we have, that we are still going to be taking that public input, and that we can use that input to tweak those maps that we have selected as our, as our few maps that we'll be considering to present. So I just wanted to say that the future public meetings that we are having, and the public meeting we've had today, as we take suggestions, that we do want that input, and that input will still inform the maps that we are going to be presenting. So just wanted to say that.
And we're finally getting to northern Utah, so we're to get the good.
And we don't want to ignore the northern Utah comments, so that's for sure. So what I'm hearing is that there's some interest in having staff help us get one of the things, but there's also some interest in taking at least a couple more days to make sure we're doing all of those maps on Commissioner Durham?
Yes, one of the issues that I don't know if it's for today, but I think we need to talk a little bit about how our selection system is going to actually operate. In the end, is it going to be a majority vote to select a final map? Or are we going to look for consensus? Or are we going to give teams turns? Or how are we going to operate as a decisional body?
And I think that's that's a really important issue. In kind of my driving preference has always been, if we can reach consensus, that's ideal. But I think we need to have a fallback provision that if we can't reach consensus, that, you know, is it consensus on a package of maps, or is it a consensus on each individual map?
Mr. Chair, I think the statute spells out what we have to do as a commission to decide upon those maps, what our votes for those support of those specific maps are before we submit those to the legislature. So for instance, I believe it's, let's say it's the congressional map. One of those maps needs to have 5 out of the 7.
At least 5, yeah.
The other 2 maps could have 4 out of 7. And one of those votes has to be from an independent, from one of the independents. So
Thank you, Karen.
I believe that's what the statute calls for. I could be.
So Matt, any further guidance on?
You're correct. You're all very familiar with the statute. And I think as we read in 282302 on the selection of the recommended maps, the guidance that it gives is, to the extent possible, each map recommended by the commission shall be approved by at least 5 members of the commission. And then it gives, if the commission is unable to obtain approval of the 5 members for all maps, then it gives that process of, okay, here's what you can do with just 4 votes, and breaks that down. What I'm understanding the chair and others have discussed is kind of a unanimous as to all package of 12, which I think would still comply, because that would be then a unanimous decision. But then should there be a challenge or an issue or someone who does not want to vote, then I think this provision would control, and
Then we would
could go
need
through
to
that
consider each
process.
map individually.
Yes.
Question, Matt, do we have to prioritize them? In other words, if we sent 3 congressional maps and these are our 3, do we have to say this is our first choice, second and third choice?
No.
That makes it easy.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
No,
That was just a heavy sigh.
well, both. If I'm trying to move this forward here. If we have the ability of our staff to come up with 6 maps we can look at, and then if any of us have really heartburn about that and really want something else, we can add that to the consideration.
Okay.
But let's get down to something practical.
Okay. I think that sounds like a reasonable approach to staff.
Yeah, we're good
Have
with that.
enough
I
direction.
think there's been good enough interaction with the commission in the mapping sessions that we're going to be able to bring each maps that all 7 will have some vested interest, at least one of those maps that you could take and move forward as your final vote, so that no one will feel unrepresented by the 6.
That's good, thank you. And have Joey know that his brother's grade will determine what he actually comes up with. David's counting on you.
The relationship, it may not be that strong, but we'll see.
Terrific, thank you.
Do you want to look at some of the other maps, or is there a similar process, or do you want?
I think we want the same process on the school board maps.
And congressional and state.
As well as the state senate and house.
I believe we can do that.
Okay.
The only thing I'd suggest is I'd like to schedule a meeting fairly quickly for that purpose of presenting the maps to the commission. We will be out of town on Wednesday night, but we could do it Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Why don't we plan on doing it as part of our either Friday or Saturday meeting of next week?
So maybe we'll plan for Friday. I think we're.
And if people have, maybe we could get a preliminary peek at our
We'll email
Wednesday
it to
public
you
hearing.
probably Tuesday. Monday's a holiday,
Okay.
so we'll get with staff. We'll have a good discussion, and you'll see a packet just listing the maps, and you can pull them up, what you'd like to do. But we'll send that out to verify that we've done it.
Leighton and Logan. Yeah.
So this will be. We'll be up north for those 2 meetings. Friday is
Layton, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, that sounds like a good town to have that discussion. Okay. I don't know. I'm just, no one's arguing. I don't know that there's a counter to
Layton
that.
is the perfect place to have that discussion. It'll be great.
Okay, and, okay.
Okay, and now I think it would be useful to have some conversation with council. We've had a series of exchanges with the Legislative Redistricting Committee on, if you'll recall at our last meeting, we were curious about when we were to present. We understood from our council that our deadline was the 1st of November to deliver our maps to the Legislative Redistricting Committee, as well as the Office of General Research and Legal Counsel. And so, Matt, I'll let you take it over from there.
I'm starting to feel bad for everyone else here in the audience, although I think they're sitting here thinking, I'm feeling so glad that I never went to law school. So maybe that's why they're like, oh, this is great. So
they're probably feeling glad they were never put on this damn commission too.
Well, I think we've all felt that way in this process with the amount of work and questions, but no.
I just wanted to make sure you know, I emailed this memo to Christine and to Bill. So okay, they have this electronically.
Okay, so this is something that we put together late last night, just wanting to make it clear, because obviously our role as counsel for the commission is to make sure that you're complying with the statutory requirements, including obviously all deadlines and other requirements with respect to the submission of the maps. Recently, there's been now some question raised as to the deadline for the submission of the maps and publication of the maps to the public to the director, and as well as the public hearing to address the maps. And so we felt we've obviously have been operating and been advising you for months now that November 1st is the deadline. And so this memo is probably a long time coming in kind of what our analysis was back then, and now just having confirmed that now. And so what I'd like to do is just walk through that with you first to explain and give you comfort, at least as what our analysis is of this deadline, but then also talk about the practical realities of, hey, we want to work with the legislative committee. We want to make sure we're all on the same page here and do it in a way that makes sense for everybody. Because we're all obviously under a great time crunch and we want to be, as accommodating as possible. But first and foremost, we want to understand what our obligations and deadlines are. So the question one that we have is what's the commission's deadline under Utah Code 28-23-031 to make the maps and report available to the public and submit them to the director of the Office of Ledge Research for distribution to the committee. And that answer that we've been telling you from early on in this process is midnight on Monday, November 1st, 2021. And so that next page is our analysis of that. And I think it's probably worth walking through just to give you an understanding of, and I would also welcome any comments if there's some questions there. But essentially, as we're all familiar with the statute, this subsection 3031 provides that the commission shall, and this is a quote, no later than 14 days after the day of the final public hearing described in subsection 28-23-011, submit to the director of the OLRGC for distribution to the committee and make available to the public the redistricting maps recommended under section 28-23-02 and a detailed written report describing each map's adherence to the commission's redistricting standards and requirements. So this is what we've been working for day one, is this detailed report, the 12 maps, huge undertaking. So we then go to subsection 28-23-011, which describes the 7 required public hearings because it's to be 14 days after that. And under that statute, it says the 7 required public hearings shall be held no later than October 17th if the commission receives the linked PL 94-171 data on or before September 1st. Now we received it on or before September 1st. So we as a commission have to comply and satisfy the 7 public hearings prior to October 17th. That is the commission's deadline. So the final required public hearing scheduled by the commission will be on Saturday, October 16th. Therefore, then you add 14 days after that, which gets us to Saturday, October 30th. Now, the Redistricting Act is a part of the Utah Election Code, and Section 104 of the Election Code addresses how deadlines within the election code are to be calculated and computed. Specifically, Utah Code 28.1.1043B says that, quote, unless otherwise expressly provided for in the election code, if a deadline that falls before or after a specified date or event falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the deadline shall be considered to fall on the following business day. Now, this section also includes a provision that says, unless expressly provided otherwise in this title, a person may complete the action anytime before midnight on the final day. So flipping the page, the section of the Redistricting Act that sets the deadline for submitting the maps, which is our 3031, does not expressly limit or otherwise exclude the applicability of this time computation provision. Thus, the plain language in Utah Code 28.1.104 is controlling and dictates that because 14 days after the last hearing falls on a Saturday, the deadline shall be considered to fall on the following business day, Monday, November 1st. So that has always been our understanding. That has been our interpretation. We feel very comfortable and confident in that interpretation. And in fact, in 2020, just recently, Judge Shelby, the chief judge at the federal district court, addressed a case, Garbutt v. Herbert, where the court addressed a deadline of another section of the election code about the signature gathering. And under that section, it expressly says that the candidates would have until January 1st, 2020, until 5 p.m., 14 days before a qualified party's convention. And so the Utah Republican Convention was an issue. They worked back 14 days, and it happened to be a Saturday. And so Judge Shelby recognized, look, because the convention was on a Saturday, and because then the deadline for submitting signature falls on a weekend, the deadline is extended to the following business day, Monday, April 13th, citing this statute that we discussed in the election code. So that gives us even further comfort in our interpretation of the plain language. We now have a judge who's also looked at a similar thing and says, yeah, when it falls on a Saturday, it carries over unless it's expressly excluded from that type of action. Another reason why we've obviously been advocating and expecting it to be the November 1st is the commission will remember back on May 11th when we were discussing and negotiating with the legislature and legislative committee. They approached us and asked us to stipulate to a movement up of the deadline. And in back re-listening to that and looking at the minutes of that, during that discussion, it was very clear many times, represented from the legislative chair of the legislative committee, that the proposal was to move the deadline from November 15th to November 1st. And then that was put in our minutes. Commissioner Hilliard said, hey, I move to adopt the deadline as to approve the legislative proposal as stated. And this commission then voted to do that. And so in short, the legislator's proposal was to move the deadline to November 1st. The plain language of the statute provides for November 1st deadline, midnight, for the commission to submit the maps and report. We feel very comfortable in that reading. I've had numerous partners at my firm look at this because we obviously have a vested interest in advising you. And as a lawyer, as Lyle and others will know, deadlines are important and you never want to miss a deadline. If there's any question on that, then we always say, well, you got to just make sure you meet the deadline, what the earliest possible week. So it has always been our understanding. And we think that under the plain language of the statute, what was proposed by the legislature, what has been interpreted by the courts is, yes, this is November 1st at midnight. We're now hearing that there may be a different view that's taken from attorneys for the legislative committee. which is obviously troubling from our standpoint because we want to make sure we get it right. And we've always felt very comfortable and confident in this. We still feel comfortable and confident in this, but the fact is now there's been a suggestion that the deadline actually is October 30th, which we don't think is the case, but that is now been raised. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. I want to address briefly question number 2, and then talk about what our advice is of how to approach this issue. So moving on to just quickly to question number 2 is, what is the deadline for the committee to hold the public hearing contemplated under Utah Code 282303-2? And the short answer is November 16th, 2021, if the maps are submitted on the deadline of November 1st. So under the statute, the committee is to hold a public meeting, and quote, for the sole purpose of considering each map recommended by the commission, and also must provide reasonable time at the meeting for, quote, the commission to present and explain the maps, the public to comment on the maps, and the committee to discuss the maps. So that's Utah Code 282303-3. Now, this section also says that the committee shall hold the public meeting no later than 15 days after the day on which the commission complies with subsection 1. So what we just discussed as our deadline on November 1st is subsection 1. When do we need to give the maps to the legislature? That we think is November 1st. So adding 15 days, if the commission publishes maps on November 1st, the committee must hold the public meeting no later than 15 days after that day. And this would result in a deadline for the public hearing of Tuesday, November 16th. So that is my firm's understanding, reading of the statute. We're very comfortable and confident in that reading and interpretation. Now, one thing that I rarely will ever do is say 100% confidence. We all have experience to understand there's always some question, but we are still very comfortable and confident in these particular deadlines, but we obviously take very seriously any suggestion, especially from counsel for the legislative committee, who's had a lot of experience, who helped draft this, any suggestion that they may be taking a different view. And we obviously want to advise you in a way that makes sure that you comply with the statute on the one hand, keep you complying legally, and also recognize the political dynamic of wanting to work together with them to make sure we're all on the same page for this. So that kind of puts us at somewhat of a crossroads where they've come back and suggested, look, we think maybe your deadline is actually October 30th instead of November 1st. And there was a recent suggestion that November 16th wasn't necessarily the deadline that they were viewing for their date to have the public hearing, but was earlier than that. And we disagree with that. We don't think the statute says that, but that is something that we're now dealing with and trying to work through with them. One question that's not addressed on here is the question of whether or not the public hearing could, under the statute, occur on the same day as the actual distribution and publication of the maps. That I think is a more difficult question. It's our view that at a minimum, the maps need to be published and provided to the public and submitted to the committee prior to the hearing. That's my firm's view. It doesn't answer the question that you could then have the meeting that day or immediately after 10 minutes. You know, I think that's a reading that one can make of the statute. I think another reading is, no, it's supposed to take place the day after, in a 15-day window, the day after until there, but that one's less clear. But there was a proposal and a potential compromise that gave us concern, where we would present something to them that they would hold this public hearing in the afternoon of November 1st, but then we wouldn't publish our report and anything till the end of the day. And we just did not feel comfortable as counsel in advising you on that, even though that would still meet the commission's deadline in our view of November 1st by midnight. We feel like that may pose problems with the timing of that hearing. Now, whether that would then result in any challenge to the commission, I don't think so. I think this is more on the committee side, because the committee is the one that decides, hey, this is when we're going to set this. And so as far as the exposure, it seems it's more from the committee side, but that's currently the reality we're dealing with. So where are we now? We think that under the statute, we're confident that the deadline is midnight on November 1st. And if the commission chose to say, look, we're going to take until that deadline, we've always understood that to be the deadline. The council tells us that deadline. You're certainly well within your rights to do that. Now, from a practical standpoint, that's probably not a good thing to do if the committee is saying, hey, we have to hold this hearing on November 1st. I think that would then create problems if we were then, even though we could legally hold on to the report maps till after that hearing, and just more, I think it would create problems for the committee, and we don't want to do that, and we don't want to create problems for you. I think from our analysis, the most advisable legal, or the one that complies in our view legally, is if we were to still stick with the deadline of November 1st, that a hearing on November 8th would be completely appropriate. It would be clearly well within the 16 or 15-day window. It would give the committee a week, and the public, perhaps even more importantly, a chance to digest the report and look at the map, such that when there is that hearing on the 8th, the committee members and the public are well prepared to come in and ask the commission questions as to those maps. So that I think is something that would be legal. It seems from a practical standpoint that might work because of the conflict that the legislative committee has from November 2nd to the 5th. But we've also seen from correspondence that there's some reluctance to hold the hearing there, and there's a preference for the committee to hold a hearing on November 1st. So our legal recommendation is, I guess, first advocating for working with them, obviously, to see if they felt comfortable in holding it on the 8th, which I understand would still be before the proposed legislative session was to start. And that we would stick with the deadline of midnight on November 1st, giving them a week, and also then to prepare you for the presentation, which will obviously take some additional time there. However, from a practical standpoint, if the legislative committee is insistent and feels like we have to have this hearing on the 1st, I think what we would recommend at that point, and I guess if they are going to continue to even make a suggestion that our deadline is not November 1st, but October 30th, then it seems most advisable from our standpoint that we've had an earth and do everything that we possibly can to get those maps in on October 30th, and then present them on November 1st, even though we would have legally and technically in our view until midnight on November 1st. That just seems to be kind of what would make the most sense from our standpoint. Now, that's obviously getting into more of the commission's views as to how they want to operate under the law and what your rights are. We certainly want to work and continue work with the legislative committee to make sure we're all on the same page of doing this, where we all feel that we're in compliance with the statute. We provided you what we think the deadlines are. And so we felt it important to explain why we've been advising you this way, because a lot of thought and effort has gone into this. We obviously take our jobs very seriously, as does the Attorneys for the Legislative Committee, and it could just be that there's a difference of opinion, and that happens with statute. We've all seen that before. But that's where we are. I'm happy to respond to any questions as to these calculations for the deadline. But I do think in the coming days, it would be well if we can obviously get on the same page with the legislative committee so that we can prepare as a commission to understand, okay, when are we going to submit our report, and when is this public hearing going to take place, which we're obviously dealing with such a small window that Every hour matters.
Thank you. Commissioner Durham.
I just had a question for Matt. And for some reason, I'm not locating the documents sent to me on this issue, but my question goes to whether or not the Legislative Council has disclosed their line of reasoning, because you didn't, I don't think you outlined that. You just had a different conclusion. And so I'm wondering whether you have in fact received a rationale and assessed it.
Yes, and that's a great question. And had I more time, I probably should have included a page in explaining kind of where they're coming from. And to be honest, I don't want to mischaracterize and misrepresent, because I think we're all just kind of looking at this issue. But my best understanding based on communications with them is that they may be taking the position that this extension to the next business day may not apply because it may fall under this notion of except as expressly provided for in the statute. And we obviously start the contrasting view. We've always read that to mean if you're going to remove yourself from that 3-day computation of time, you need to say that. That's our reading of that, to say, hey, and by the way, this is a real deadline. If it happens to fall on a Saturday, it doesn't matter. That's the expectation. And absent any of that type of language, I think the understanding what Judge Shelby saw with the other deadline that is similar to ours in not expressly addressing the computation of time. And in fact, that deadline was more specific with the 5 p.m. and this, and even shortened it, but that's what gave us even more confidence that this would apply. But my best understanding of their position is that the computation of time, because of the compressed schedule, is something that is accepted. And maybe I'm not giving them full credit for that, and I'm happy to have conversations with them, but based on what they've sent to me, that seems to be kind of what their position is. And we just simply disagree, but we certainly would want to analyze that to see if there's something else that they're looking at.
Great, thank you.
I'd love your opinion as well, Chief Justice Durham. I mean, I sent an email to Commissioner Hilliard and to you and to Judge Thorne, just because, these are tricky issues, and we want to make sure we're getting it right. And I've talked to many of my partners to make sure that we're giving you good advice. And we feel that it is, but we also have this practical reality of if that's the position they're taking it. And could we win in court? Yes, but is that a fight we want to take? And I don't think so. I don't think that's worth it. And so we're just trying to do our best to make sure you comply with the law and that we can find a schedule that works well for everybody.
Please.
There's a joke in the legislature that you pass the budget the last night at midnight because you can't wait any longer. I think we just need to gear ourselves up to say, we'll have it done Friday or Saturday and submit it. I don't believe in the whole process that an extra day is going to make that much difference. The process really be, we will submit our recommendations. They will either accept them or reject them, outline that, assume they accept them, and assume we find some changes we want to make that may come after that. Hopefully we'll have our meetings done well before then. We'll have our working done well before then. Then they have to introduce in the legislature, and it has to pass the legislature. And then the question of governor's veto and all that stuff. So whatever we recommend is not going to be last said, no more could be said about it. So I think rather than risk even this, because as a practical matter, if we take your position and you're correct, and the Legislative Legal Counsel says, oh, they're late, they're 24 hours late. For that reason, the legislature rejects our study because we didn't comply with the statute. By the time we get to a Judge Shelby or whoever it may be to make a decision, it's too late. I mean, how are they going to undo unless you get a hearing before January First, I think it puts us in a very practical problem. I think politically, the legislature would be foolish to say, well, there's a dispute, we're going to strictly hang by that and reject our position without even hearing it. But that's a political thing. But my strong recommendation is we have everything done and submitted to Saturday before on 30th.
Other thoughts? I think my position all along is I want to be cooperative as much as I can, but it's when we initially talked about it with them, and this is what Matt raised was, they suggested, well, make a presentation and then deliver your report later that night if you need to, and that's what really raised the council's concern of we need to have the maps delivered before we have the public hearing by the plain reading of the statute, and so. While I know that we would prefer that the legislature take more time to consider the maps that we have, does anybody have any concerns? Please, Commissioner Durham.
I'm inclined to agree with Lyle in that, and the issue for me is whether the extra 24 hours, what difference that makes to us. If it's really critical to us, we could stand on our legal advice. And in terms of my own opinion, it's a perfectly legitimate and plausible interpretation of the statute. But that doesn't mean that in a debate before a court, it might not go the other way. And that doesn't mean, as Lyle points out, that we wouldn't end up in some kind of a scuffle with the legislature if they stick to their guns. So I'm inclined to think that caution might be the better response. An abundance of caution.
I have another question.
Too much caution.
Do we anticipate that the legislative committee that Monday night will vote yes or no on our action? Or will they take it under advisement to be considered as they get into the special session, what they want to do?
They have an additional set of redistricting hearings scheduled for the 8th and 9th of November. And so my assumption, and again, it is an assumption, it has not been expressly stated by the legislative leadership of the committee. But my assumption was that they would hear us, they would then take the time to digest before acting on the 8th or the 9th.
That's my understanding. And if I may add just one point, and I think you're making some very smart and wise comments, and just to confirm, we will obviously do whatever we can to make it happen and work for you and getting the commission ready. I think there's also another element of ensuring that the public has sufficient time to look at it such that when they go to this public meeting, that they can have an opportunity to speak with some benefit of understanding of what it is that we're presenting and not maybe seeing it for the first time. And that's why, even if they move to do it on the first, getting it a few days early, even how difficult that may be for us, I think has the added benefit of giving the public. And as I've thought more about this too, of just keep on. I suspect even as those weeks leading up to it, we always have our maps ready, that we would just advise the public to say, look, our report may not be done. This is a huge report that has to explain every map and how it complies with every criteria. But here's the maps we're looking at. They may be tweaked a little bit, but go take a look at it over these next 2 weeks, even though they're not finalized, so that they can then be prepared. So that might be another way, hopefully, to just kind of satisfy that goal, as I see it under the statute of having the public have the opportunity at that legislative committee to actually comment and speak on the map. So it's certainly a lot of work on us, but we'll do it, and that's what we do. And if we need to move it up from what we were expecting, we'll do everything we can to do that and get you ready for that presentation then on Monday. But I think also it might be advisable to make this known to the public, to say, hey, you may not be able to digest our 100-page report quickly. We'll try to get it to you to Saturday for the Monday hearing, but please, if you're interested, start looking at these particular maps.
Commissioner Hill?
Yeah, I think what Commissioner Hilliard has said, I think that's wise advice. I think you're correct. But I share the concern that you voiced as well. I think to give the public enough time to review the maps, which, and we will have those up on the website. We have all of our maps up on the website. And hopefully we can get a report out in enough time too for the public to make comment. But just as important, I think, for the public to see those and be able to opine on those maps is really for that legislative committee to also have time to look at those maps and to see the rationale behind those maps. So I feel like that's really important. So I guess just questions I have, and perhaps nobody has the answers today, but the question of, will there be discussion on that Monday, November 1st, about those maps? And will there be a vote by the committee that day to either accept or reject the maps that are presented from the commission? And are they leaving the 8th and the 9th scheduled meetings for discussion on their own legislative maps? So I guess that's the question I have. And just really, with all of the work, the effort of the public to initiate, a proposition that ends up in a independent redistricting commission, and for there not to be acceptable time for the legislative committee to really consider the maps that are presented. To me, that is a big issue. So I'd love to know that if we can find out that information.
And I could speak to that, I think.
Whether or not there will
issues,
be a vote on that day. And then just the question of the special session. So the 8th and the 9th, from what you understand, those are just legislative committee meetings that day for those days for the legislative redistricting committee, and not the special session to decide upon the maps.
Well, let me address those. I'll start with that one.
Okay.
The reason, what I've noticed is on the website for the Legislative Redistricting Committee is there's a scheduled meetings for the 8th and 9th. How that relates or comports with any potential special session, I don't have those details, and I don't know exactly when, if or when that's going to start. I know back in May, they said we want to hold it right before Thanksgiving. That's why they moved the deadline up to November 1st to give them time to do that. But yes, that's, now to answer your questions with respect to kind of the process. So the statute that we've been through outlines what the legislative committee is required to do during that hearing. And there's really three things. It's for the sole purpose of discussing the maps. And during that meeting, they are required to give a reasonable opportunity for the commission to present and explain the maps, a reasonable opportunity for the public to comment on the maps. And then it says that they shall discuss the maps. It's my understanding that no vote will be taken on those maps up or down, but it's just more an opportunity at that point to discuss and have that conversation with both the commission and the public on those maps. Now, to your point of, when they can hold it and preparation, part of why, from our view, it seems to make a lot of sense, of producing the maps on the deadline on the 1st and then having the hearing on the 8th, is that then gives that time for the public and the committee to look at that. Now, under the statute, they can hold it whenever they want, within 15 days after the date of submission. And if they choose to do it on that Monday, how much they will have digested or looked at is obviously unknown. And regardless of when they hold it, who knows how much they will have, looked at it beforehand. But to that point, we would certainly, at least from the public standpoint, and hopefully the committee, try to get those available as soon as possible and as much time before the hearing as possible, just to hopefully give everyone involved that opportunity to digest. But under the statute, there's no kind of saying that it can't take place for 3 or 4 days after you consider it. It's just really a deadline of November 16th, at which point. Does that answer all your questions that you raised?
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments?
Well, thank you for your time, and we'll obviously work together on this in the coming days. And I don't know if Obviously, if there's a consensus as to how we want to approach those deadlines, we can talk about how best to communicate that with the legislative committee, but I think getting everybody on the same page sooner than later is obviously going to be beneficial for everybody.
No.
Did we ever get a reply to the letter you sent or with your name that Matt drafted?
Yes, they sent us a letter to reply late last night, I think.
They did, and that motivated this because and I think you were copying on it, so it's in your inbox, and that's where we're having this disagreement as to kind of what the deadlines are under the statute. I believe some of the correspondence suggested that there was a question whether November 8th was too late. Now, we don't view that. We don't understand where that date comes from, and I'd love to understand more information on that. But there was a response back, and we'll publish this, and I'm always open to talk with whomever at the legislative council. They've been very, responsive and jumping on the phone, and I've really appreciated that, and trying to understand their position, and hopefully this helps them better understand our position of what we think the statute provides.
Okay, not having seen that email, what was their response? Are they adamant that it'd be on October 30, we turn in the data, or are they open to a November 8th?
No, they're sticking to their guns that they want us to present on November 1st. And they're positing that on the assumption that the deadline really is the 30th as opposed to the 1st. Although anyway, yeah.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And there was a suggestion that November 7th would be the deadline for the public hearing, and we just don't see that or understand how that could be calculated based on the language of 15 days after compliance. I don't know how that suggestion was made. So I just invite you to read the letter. If you have questions about it and want to talk about the kind of our legal response to that, I'm happy to do it. But I think what Commissioner Hilliard and the rest of us is kind of recognizing, let's just figure out how best to do this in a way that complies with the statute from everybody's view, and gives sufficient time at least to consider these big issues.
Anything else?
Well, since I haven't heard, everyone's quiet now. Am I making the assumption that our consensus is we will submit paperwork on the 30th?
Well, I'm getting a sense from several of you that you're suggesting you'd be comfortable with that.
Sure.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
When you're discussing this with the legislative committee, would they want some further explanation or have a presence of the commission on their meetings on the 9th? Or when they no recommendations can be made at the special session, but I don't know if they would want to hear more from the commission. So maybe that's part of the discussion as well.
Any further items, please?
I assume that
I hope so.
okay, because actually, when they have committee hearings, we can ask for a public input to be a member, come and make a house. So that's an issue I'm going to raise right now. I really would want our staff, when they get these, see how the Senate and the House map blend together in this aspect. I would hate to see the buckle, as we talk about to put together, punish the same county both in the House and the Senate. And I think If, for example, we have to do something crunching in say, Summit County, we don't, in the Senate, we don't crunch them there in the House. So I think if the staff can look at that, because my experience has been when the House bill passes, or the Senate, it passes. So you usually get veto-proof majorities. Well, so the governor will have to be negotiating if he wants to have any input on it during the process, not after it passes. Okay.
Thank you. Any further comments?
Can we go back to the map refinement for about 1 minute?
Yes.
And I'll be quick because I know we're all hungry. I've shown a few of you what happens when we take all of our congressional maps and we stack them on top of each other in the GIS software. And there's but they're not exact. Those need to be cleaned up. But first we need to get down to our 3 maps each. We're going to need some time to resolve those discrepancies. And so we're going to have to factor that into our workflow. My thought, and I've not shared this with anyone, is that we take one person from each team and so forth in making adjustments so that to become one where intended. But it is going to modify our numbers slightly. And so I think each team ought to be represented. We're going to factor into our workflow as we go about the cleanup efforts.
Okay. Thank you.
You know, maybe if legal counsel or maybe even legislative counsel, but at least sit down with us, because when we get finished, somebody has to draft a bill. And that can be very, very difficult.
The software actually prepares that.
Okay.
It takes the sentence, it says census block 1, 2, 3 is assigned to District 12 or whatever.
Good.
And it's a long report.
All 77,000 of those blocks. Okay. Not hearing any other discussion, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I so moved.
This motion, or this meeting is hereby adjourned. And we